This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Go to our website at wdtatpodcast.com and click on support to learn how you can be part of this effort to learn how to have better conversations, increase compassion, and build bridges, not walls. You can make a one-time donation or become a patron for as little as $1 a month and receive patron-only benefits. Thanks to all of our patrons at any level for your support. You are what makes this happen and what makes this possible. Thank you. Now let's get into the interview. In this episode, I talked to Carl McColman about technology's effect on us, why we are afraid of silence, and what it can contribute to better conversations. This will be a two-part conversation that we will finish next week. On his podcast, Encountering Silence, they always take a 30-second pause of silence in the middle of the episode. I have also done that in these two episodes as a way for us to practice pausing and entering into silence as well. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is Carl McColman. He's the author of numerous books, including Unteachable Lessons, Answering the Contemplative Call, Befriending Silence, and The Big Book of Christian Mysticism, which is one I recently acquired, but I haven't started yet, which I'm really excited about. And he's also the co-host of the podcast Encountering Silence. Welcome to the podcast, Carl.
Oh, it's good to be here. Thank you, Lucas.
So my podcast, We Don't Talk About That, is focused on things that we maybe avoid talking about, or how to have difficult conversations, how to talk about things. And your podcast is about not talking. So here we are.
Well,
yeah.
Or it's about talking about not talking.
That's true. It's not an entire podcast of white noise or silence, or you are talking about talking. But I thought it would be really great to talk to you about the role that silence plays in our lives, but also in how we engage with one another and engage the world, because I do feel like it has a significant role to play. But before we dive too deeply into that, tell us a little bit about yourself, as if being an author and hosting a podcast isn't enough. Where are you at in the world, and what are some of the things that you are up to?
Well, I live just outside of Clarkston, Georgia, which is a suburb of Atlanta. So okay. I'm in the American South. I've lived in the United States my entire life. I was born in Louisiana, grew up in Virginia. So what do I say about myself? As you know, I've written a number of books. I had, when I was a teenager, I had a kind of a spiritual awakening experience or encounter with the mystery, if you want to call it that. And so I've been kind of on an intentional kind of spiritual journey most of my life. My faith of origin, my family faith is Christianity. So I still consider that my home faith. But I like to say I'm anchored in Christianity, but I'm not constrained by Christianity. So I'm very much interested in inner spirituality, interfaith dialogue, kind of the conversation between the great religious and wisdom traditions as well. So the interest in silence, I guess, kind of really, for me, grew out of the interest in spirituality and the interior life. I studied for a number of years with an organization in Washington, D.C., which is where I did my graduate work, called the Shalem Institute. And Shalem was, again, kind of, emerged out of this kind of interreligious or interspiritual conversation. It was founded by several Christians, but Christians who were in conversation with Tibetan Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole focus was on how kind of East and West can inform and kind of enlighten one another, if I can use that term, especially in terms of spiritual practice. So, with kind of the Christian piece, certainly there was kind of this, the roots in Christian monasticism and in the Christian prayer tradition, Christian mysticism, which is kind of a loaded term, but, kind of the interior dimension of the Christian experience as opposed to maybe the institutional church. But then again, kind of looking at it in conversation with other traditions that maybe have a more preserved or more readily accessible meditation tradition or kind of interior practice tradition. So that's what Shalem kind of is all about. I was in graduate school when I discovered them, worked with them for several years, learned kind of a Christian approach to meditation and contemplation, and, had a number of twists and turns over the years, eventually began to study with the Trappist monks. If you're familiar with Thomas Merton or Thomas Keating, they were both Trappists. So, I'm here in Georgia in the American South, and there's a Trappist monastery about 20 miles from where I live. And so I've worked with the monks there for going on 15 years now. So that's become a pretty significant part of my, my formation. And, and when I was in high school, I read the book Mysticism by Evelyn Underhill, who was a British writer who lived in the early 20th century. The book came out in 1911. And it was really formational for me and kind of introducing me to the inner, the inner tradition of Christianity. And Anne Lamott, I'm sure you're familiar with her. Anne Lamott, I heard her on a talk on public radio once where she said her advice to beginning writers was write the book you wish you could have read. So the book I wish I could have read was kind of a 21st century update, if you will, of Evelyn Underhill's book. So that's what became the Big Book of Christian Mysticism. So it's kind of my love letter to Evelyn Underhill. And the book is really based on, there's a German theologian who lived in the 20th century named Karl Rahner. He was a Jesuit. But he's famous for saying that the Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist. And so that's really what my book is kind of takes as the starting point. And this idea that we already see, certainly on its institutional level, Christianity is in crisis. Many of the institutional churches have declining memberships, especially in North America or in Europe. The younger you are, the less likely you are to identify as Christian, regardless of your family's faith history. So kind of the institutional side of Christianity is changing very rapidly. And so, so this question of, well, is there this kind of interior dimension that is somehow distinct from the institutional that maybe is worth preserving, even as the institutional side really does seem to be, changing, and in some cases seems to be diminishing. So that's really, what that book kind of explores. And to everybody's surprise, mine, most of all, the book has done quite well. So that, gave me the opportunity to keep writing and, eventually, start a blog and, as you know, to eventually start the Encountering Silence podcast. So silence is a pretty important kind of nutrient of, I think, any kind of sustained spiritual practice. You need silence for meditation. You need silence for contemplation. You need silence really for just interior reflection. So that's how I became interested in silence. But of course, especially working with Kevin and Cassidy, both of whom come at silence from slightly different perspectives, I've become much more interested in silence on a number of levels, looking at it kind of on a psychological level, on a political level, in terms of creativity. So there's a lot there that we can play with.
Yeah. Well, one thing you said that kind of struck me, I many years ago worked in youth ministry, and at the time was very interested in a lot of more ancient practices in Christianity, and one of those was practices of silence. And so I actually did some practices of silence with the youth, and I was always very surprised at how hungry teenagers were for silence. You mentioned that you were a little bit surprised that your book has done so well, but it seems like places where we seem to assume in youth ministry, you've got to have like games and loud craziness, and that actually those teenagers were very hungry for silence. And so it seems this is something that maybe some people are a little more prone to, or it's easier for them, or they hunger a little more for it in some way based on their personality or something. But that it is something that seems like people want, that there's a hunger for it.
Oh, that's a wonderful question. And, that would certainly be my experience too. I think that we have kind of a cultural assumption that silence is scary. And, and I think there certainly is, a segment of, the population. And again, I'm speaking, from the vantage point of a white middle-class American, but, so, different in different places, but certainly, that there's a certain segment of the population that needs to keep a TV running all the time, has the radio on at night, those kinds of things. But I think that you're right. I think that there are many, many people for whom silence can actually represent a refuge, and, and an opportunity to withdraw from, what I think arguably is the kind of hostility of the constant stream of information, of noise and data, that we voluntarily subject ourselves to. One of my disciplines is that when I'm done working at the end of the day, I turn the computer off. And, and I was laughing with a friend of mine this morning. We were talking, and I said, and yet it is so tempting to then pick up the phone, and just start looking things up on the browser on my phone. The addiction to having information immediately available is pretty easy to fall into. And so, so I think we all, are prone to that sense that, that I can't really disengage. And I'm using silence in a broad sense here, not just in terms of auditory silence, but I would suggest that, disengaging from, from just the internet screen, from Wikipedia or the Huffington Post or anything like that, where you're getting information that maybe you're not listening to, but you're reading. That silence is an opportunity to step away from that as well, to step away from the Twitter feed. And it's just my sense that for many people, taking the plunge and taking the risk to actually try that, people are surprised at how good that feels. To step away, even just for a short period of time. I'll tell you something that I find really kind of sad, but again, it speaks to this tension that we're exploring here. I have a friend who, and he's retired now, probably in his mid to late 70s, but his career was spent managing church camps, campgrounds owned by churches that then people would come to do weekend retreats or parish missions or, the summer church camps, those kinds of things, catering both to young people and to adults. And what this friend told me, he and I were talking a few years ago, and he said, most of the camps are finding that they have to make Wi-Fi available. That people don't see Wi-Fi as a luxury; they see it as a necessity. And if the camp does not offer Wi-Fi service, then people don't just go to a different camp. The camp begins to lose business. And so, if the church camp, if part of its mission is to provide this environment that gets us out of our normal, kind of everyday rhythm, into a place where we can kind of tend to our soul, tend to that silent place within us. It's, this kind of addiction that we have to information is, kind of militates against that. So, so one of the things I love to do when I lead a retreat is I, just challenge people, can you just turn it off?
Mm-hmm.
Just, the phone has an off button, just turn it off and just try, you've got it there. If there's an emergency, then it's available.
Mm-hmm.
But just take the chance. And again, some people it's very difficult, but others find it really meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like some of that has to do with the discipline, as you were saying before, the discipline of turning off your computer. I'm always a little nervous about blaming the tool or blaming the technology too much, although clearly it's rapidly changed, and the amount of information that's available constantly is a significant change, and I don't want to diminish that, but sometimes we tend to blame the internet or Facebook, and I often see it as a bit of a reflection of ourselves, how we use it, right? It may be sort of manipulating us a little bit into, well, it's always on and always available, and that certainly has an effect. But having the discipline to turn it off or find ways to use the tool. I use an app for centering prayer, and I've started using Headspace for some meditation on things like self-compassion that I'm finding helpful. And so it has, both sides to it, but you're right. That constant stream of information, I just had this image of somebody on Twitter or Facebook in silence, but scrolling through the feed, and it's not a very silent silence. It's not a still silence at all. So that's an interesting image.
There's still some emotional content or some cognitive content,
right?
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Here's what I would say about the tool, and I agree with you absolutely. Don't blame the tool, for the fact that you still have agency, you still have choices. But I think I think perhaps what we may be in a situation where we are not training ourselves in terms of best practices for how to use these tools. And I mean this kind of on a cultural level, that probably we need, when you think about, again, social media, and the reality is that even if you identify yourself by your name, everything I put out there says Carl McColman on it. But a lot of people, of course, they may take pseudonyms or have a handle or whatever. But even if you are identified by your name, there's still this reality that you're interacting with a telephone or with a desktop or a laptop, and you're just interacting with data that shows up there, and you don't have the sense of interacting with the human being, that's in California or in Ireland or wherever it might be, and so. The kind of normal rules of engagement, in terms of kindness and civility and, giving people the benefit of the doubt. It's like we haven't quite figured out how to apply those to this new tool for communication, because that's all it is. Right. All the internet is a tool for communication, but it's a different tool than what we've had before. And so, there's a fascinating book, came out about, 15 or 20 years ago. It's called The Alphabet versus the Goddess. The Alphabet versus the Goddess. The author's name is Leonard Schlein. He was a Jewish man. And it's interesting, he was like a physician or something. He wasn't necessarily, an anthropologist or a philosopher or anything like that, but except in an amateur sense. But what this book was kind of his theory on tracing kind of the history of human spiritual development, looking at it in the light of our technologies of communication. And so, for example, one of the things that he said was that when we developed the capacity to write, what you tend to find in cultures that become, literate cultures as opposed to simply oral cultures, is that then there tends to be the emergence of the worship of a monotheistic male god.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, so of course, and writing as somebody of Jewish ancestry, that was kind of exhibit A, was the development of the Jewish literary tradition, the Jewish scripture, and then the Jewish kind of cult of the one male God. But then he also compares that to the Quran and to the hieroglyphs of Egypt, and various places where monotheistic religion emerges. And then he, fast forward to our day, where you have kind of a resurgence of the image with television, with improved printing methods, photography, now with the internet. And so what do we see is we see a resurgence of, and again, it's marginal, it's not mainstream, but it is there, a resurgence of polytheism and of a more feminine understanding of the divine, goddess worship, that kind of thing. Wow. So he makes the argument that that our technology of communication actually impacts how we shape our spiritual or religious way of seeing the world. And what was really fascinating was when he talked about the radio was invented, and then we see the rise of Hitler, because of course Hitler was whatever you can say about the man, evil genius, but he was a master of oratory, and he used the radio to consolidate his support and whip up his following, and the same thing you could argue today with Trump and the rise of this one particular kind of political animal, whether you like him or hate him. He certainly has been the first president that has really relied on social media to get his message out, and so so he's reinventing the rules of what it means to be a political leader before our very eyes, using this form of communication that literally did not exist 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot there. There's this technology. It's not the technology's fault, but what the technology is doing is providing us with new forms of communication that maybe we haven't caught up with yet. And we haven't really, as a society, established best practices. Yeah. And so, so in the meantime, we're all stumbling through, and on the one hand, it's kind of like, an accident, you can't turn away, you have to watch it. There's some ways in which social media does seem to be kind of a communication train wreck. But then on the other hand, there's this question of, can you turn it off? Can you step away and reflect on it, and reflect on this question of how can I use this tool in a creative way and in a way that is mindful and respectful and in service of the common good, rather than just is reactive and just kind of caters to my own, my kind of my reptilian mind, my more base instincts. And so that's the kind of question I think we all have to continually be reflecting on.
Please take a moment to connect with yourself and your breath and enter into silence for 30 seconds. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that we've kind of gone in this direction, partly because it's making me think of the way that television in the early days, and radio as well, they had times where there was dead air, right? That they were off for the night, or there were pauses, and this always on nature of the internet, that there's always more to see, always more to read and hear. There's more podcasts to listen to. That always on contributes to a lot of the phenomenon we see, like fake news and the ways we interact online, because there's no pause. There's no pause built into it where we naturally take breaks or are almost forced to take breaks. And so now we have to think about being disciplined. And I do see some technologies being developed, right? Like the way that parents have parental controls on their networks that turn the internet off, at certain times of the day, or they have time limits for their kids. And then maybe we need, as adults, some of those time limits to help us. And there are apps, that track your usage and all of that sort of stuff. But I was just thinking, as you were sharing, the way that the always-on nature of information and the internet really contributes to it being very difficult for us to take a break, and the kind of the nature of the conversations we have, mm-hmm. right? So when it's always on, we're always in reaction mode. We're always just responding to the next thing, the next argument on Facebook, or the next meme that comes up, or whatever. And so we end up in this very reactionary place. And, silence, no matter pre-internet or anytime, is always this taking of a pause in some way, right? No matter what your silence practice mm-hmm. is, to step back and to, as you said, you kind of enter into this interior space. So maybe we can kind of turn toward that interior space. And you mentioned before that it's a place that scares a lot of people, and especially since there seems to be so little room in our culture for those pauses and that interior space. What is it that scares us so much about silence? And why do we tend to avoid it so much? And how can we maybe build it more into our lives?
I'm just going to be speculative here. I certainly am not, mm-hmm. somebody who's, done a dissertation on this or anything, but just, kind of based on my own anecdotal kind of, sense of things. I think that, there is a basic kind of existential angst just being alive. We're all going to die. Mm-hmm. We know we're going to die. Mm-hmm. Most of us, even those of us who identify as happy, I identify myself as a very happy person, but, I don't have everything I want in life. I have things that I worry about, and I'm getting older. And so the anxiety associated with that, et cetera, et cetera. So many people are unfulfilled in their, in their romantic or sexual lives, or they're unfulfilled in their work, So there's just the what did the Buddha say? Life is suffering, there is this essential, sufferingness to being alive. And I think part of what, we live in an entertainment culture. Part of what our culture does is it keeps us distracted. We're distracted by sports. We're distracted by music, by Hollywood and television, or social media, cute kitten videos, all of that kind of militates to keep us entertained, to keep us kind of amused. And so, the first thing that silence does is it takes all of that away. And we simply just have to face the reality of who we are. The reality that, that life isn't perfect. Life is terminal. Life has a measure of suffering. All of that is true. I know one of the things you explore on this podcast is conflict. We all have conflict in our lives in some way, shape, or form. I mean, you may be the most kind of privileged person out there. You live in the lap of luxury. You have material affluence. You've got a loving, caring family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, this is the story of the Buddha. If in any way you're paying attention, you understand that you're in a position of privilege and others don't share that privilege. So then immediately there's that question of, that, do I deserve the wealth that I have when so many other people are hungry? Do I deserve the social privilege of being a white person in North America when people of color, have to experience microaggression and other, just ordinary ways in which their lives carry a measure of suffering that I'm shielded from? All of these kinds of questions are just part of the reality of life. What I think stepping into silence forces us to do is to face ourselves and to face our finitude, to face our mortality, to face our suffering, to face our powerlessness. But that doesn't let us off the hook, because we are powerless, but we are not absolutely powerless. We all do have some agency, so if you have agency, then you also have responsibility. What are you going to do to alleviate suffering, whether it's your own suffering or the suffering of loved ones or the suffering of the world at large? So then we're faced with the kind of the vocation to act, the vocation to make a difference. And that sometimes is challenging. Well, maybe I don't want to make a difference. Maybe I just want to go back to watching the next Marvel movie, and see what Spider-Man's up to.
Right.
It's there's a level on which we are all, we all like being entertained. And that, we all willingly participate in it. Nobody forces you to go buy a ticket to see Star Wars, and yet, that movie's going to make $1 billion. Marvel movies make $1 billion. We all willingly participate in this kind of culture of distraction. And so if nothing else, it really just, puts just front and center, right squarely in front of you, the chaos of the world that we live in. One of the spiritual teachers that has really been important to me, he passed away about 4.5 years ago. His name was Kenneth Leach. He was a priest of the Church of England. He lived in London and was very engaged in working to combat racism. And back in the 1960s, he was working with young people who were homeless or who had heroin addictions, those kinds of things. Always kind of working with the people who fell through the cracks of society, and just trying to make a difference in their lives. And yet also he was very much engaged with, again, kind of the Christian spiritual tradition, the contemplative and mystical tradition. And so he was one of the first writers to really articulate that you can't separate spirituality and the struggle for justice, that they belong together. And of course, now we have people like Richard Rohr, and he's probably the best known, but a number of others like that. Jim Wallace is another one, who are very much engaged in this conversation of how do you bring spirituality and justice together. Well, Ken Leach was having this conversation 40 years ago. So one of the things I love about Kenneth Leach is that, again, he talks about this integration of spirituality and the struggle for justice. Well, he wrote a wonderful passage. I don't have it in front of me, so I can't quote it word for word. But basically this passage that says to enter into contemplation, to enter into that silence within yourself, means to explore the waste of your own being. And he says contemplation, and in contemplation you could really almost substitute silence. Contemplation or intentional silence, basically the same thing. Contemplation always has a context, and the context that we find ourselves in today. And again, he's writing in the 1980s, but he's saying, racism, economic injustice, militarism, urban decay, human loneliness, those kinds of things. And he says it's in that context that the contemplative explores the waste of their own being. And so, 30, 40 years later, we can say, if anything, it's gotten worse, and we see, we see so much violence and so much alienation and conflict here in the United States. There's just this incredible sense of division, in terms of how people identify what it means to live a good life, or to, the choices that our public institutions need to make to make the world better, or to make our society better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This incredible division. How do we bridge that? And so the first thing is that we just have to acknowledge that we live in this world with so much suffering and so much that needs to be done. And so stepping into your own interior silence is really a way of saying, I refuse to be separate from that I'm part of this world, and that what I do, the choices I make, the commitments I make, the action I take matters. And that it's essential that I have to be the person who I'm called to be. I'm going to speak in a religious sense. Again, not everybody shares my religious faith, but that if there is a God, I believe God is a God of justice. God is a God of relationship and of reconciliation. And so I don't really, as somebody who has said, I believe in God, I don't have the option. I have to calibrate my life toward reconciliation and toward justice. Yeah. And, and that's hard work, and it's overwhelming. Fortunately, we don't have to do it alone. But again, that's another challenge, is that because we are such a distracted society, we have also become in many ways a very alienated society, and people don't have a sense of community anymore. And so, so paradoxically, this moving into your inner life, your interior life, finding that silence in your own heart impels you to recognize that you have to be in a relationship with other people, or else life just isn't worth living. Yeah. And so, so there's that piece too, that just becomes part of the experience.
Yeah, I think that gets really close to why I wanted to talk to you and wanted to talk about silence on this podcast, because it's a little bit counterintuitive to people maybe who aren't so steeped in contemplative practices, or people that are doing this kind of work and talking about different practices of silence, that silence and this spending time in the interior world and work really brings us to others and leads us to action and leads us to greater connection and compassion to the rest of the world. Because a lot of people have seen it for so many years as nuns and monks sort of living separately from the world, or you maybe have your New Age practitioners that seem very selfish, or there's so many different ways that we see those kinds of meditation practices as self-focused or somehow separate and disconnected from the world. And I think what's really, really important to get across to people is that these practices of silence and spending time in our own minds, in our own souls, and doing work internally leads to greater connection and compassion, and it does drive us out into the world, or it should, right? If it's not doing that, then you need to check in that maybe there's something off about your your silence practice. Maybe.
And I think silence can be abused like anything else. Which then leads to the whole question of how silence does get abused, which I think you can't have a conversation about silence without having, paying attention to that people who have power over other people will sometimes use silence to enforce that power. And we call that on our podcast, we call that toxic silence. And the simplest example of that, you've heard the phrase, the silent treatment. A married couple have a fight and they don't know how to move through the conflict. And so the conversation just breaks down and they stop speaking to one another. And if that were to persist, that would be a major warning sign that there's something seriously wrong with the relationship. But I think, the argument could be made that there are all sorts of silent treatments in our culture. There are conversations that it's not okay to have. It's not okay to have conversations in certain contexts. It's not okay to have conversations about sex and gender. It's not okay to have conversations about privilege and what it means to have privilege or not to have privilege. And so it's interesting. I interviewed I worked for a magazine a number of years back, and I interviewed a man named John O'Donohue, who's written a number of wonderful books, Irish Spirituality. He was an Irish Catholic priest, eventually left the priesthood. And he died about, 15 years ago now. It's very sad, he died young. He had a heart attack. But I interviewed him in the late 90s. So it was, a little over 20 years ago now. And I remember we were talking and I was asking him, kind of his assessment of the world we live in. And he said, well, one of the problems we have is the problem of unheld conversations. And I said, what do you mean? What do you mean by unheld conversations? And he said, well, let me just give you one example. And he said, and I blame the universities for this. He said, but we're not having a conversation about Christianity and Islam. And he said, if we don't have that conversation, real soon there's going to be major destruction. And this was in 1998 or 99. And of course, 2 years later, we have 9/11. And all that we've seen, up to, we're seeing it right now, here in January of 2020, the conflict between the United States and Iran, continues. So, and we know that there are problems that went back, even before 1979 with the fall of the Shah. The Shah was actually installed by the CIA back in the 1950s. So this has been a long brewing problem, of course. But just that concept of unheld conversation, that's an example of a toxic silence, a silence that does not give life, but that actually prevents the kind of conversation that is necessary for real reconciliation and real community building to take place.
Thanks for joining us today on We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land. If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Help us spread the word by sharing it on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can support the podcast by visiting our website at wdtatpodcast.com and clicking on Support. You can make a one-time donation or consider becoming a monthly supporter through Patreon. You'll receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits. Thanks for your support. We would love to hear from you. Leave us a voicemail by going to our website and clicking Send Voicemail. Your voicemail could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at wdtatpodcast@gmail.com. Many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. A final thought from Brené Brown. The willingness to show up changes us. It makes us a little braver each time. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?
Que le vaya bien.